Melanie adjusted the white collar of her uniform, feeling the weight of the ID badge around her neck. She stood at the entrance of the Miller mansion, its towering presence more imposing than she had imagined. The 3-story structure loomed above her, surrounded by manicured gardens and fountains that sparkled under the late afternoon sun. It was the epitome of wealth. Perfectly trimmed hedges, bronze statues of animals she couldn't even name, and a sprawling driveway that seemed to stretch for miles. For a moment, she almost forgot why she was there. It had been months since she'd found herself in this kind of position, desperate for a steady paycheck, overwhelmed with overdue bills. Nursing had always been a calling, but lately, it felt like a constant battle just to make ends meet. And then came the Miller family. They promised good pay, a comfortable schedule, and a chance to put the financial strain behind her. But now, standing before their mansion, she couldn't shake the feeling that this job wasn't just about the paycheck. Something about the place felt off, like it hid a secret behind every gleaming surface, every shadow that seemed to stretch just a little too long in the fading daylight. Melanie shook the feeling off, smoothed down the front of her uniform, and rang the golden doorbell. The door swung open almost immediately, revealing Gregory Miller, tall, impeccably dressed, his hair graying but neatly styled. His cold, evaluating gaze swept over her from head to toe before he stepped aside with an abrupt, "You must be the new nurse." "Melanie," she replied, offering a tight smile as she stepped past him. The grand foyer was bathed in a soft light that bounced off the polished marble floors, the scent of fresh flowers mixed with beeswax, giving the air an almost sterile quality. But it wasn't just the house's perfection that made Melanie feel uneasy. It was the silence. It seemed too still, too quiet, as if this mansion's grandeur had muted everything inside. Gregory didn't wait for her to take in her surroundings. He turned sharply and led her down a hallway, his footsteps echoing on the marble. Melanie followed, doing her best to keep up with his brisk pace, but the silence between them was deafening. They stopped before an ornately carved door, and Gregory knocked twice before entering without waiting for an answer. Inside, an elderly woman sat in a wheelchair, her once regal features softened by age. Her snow-white hair was styled in a neat bun, and she wore a soft blue outfit, its color a match for the warmth still in her eyes. This was Eleanor Miller, 87, frail, yet carrying an air of dignity that only time could afford. "You must be Melanie." Eleanor's voice was soft, almost like velvet, welcoming despite the coldness of her son. She smiled at Melanie with a grace that seemed at odds with the sterile atmosphere surrounding them. Before Melanie could respond, Gregory shifted uncomfortably behind his mother, his posture rigid as if her warmth embarrassed him. He cleared his throat. "Let's get this over with," he muttered. Melanie forced a smile. "It's nice to meet you, Mrs. Miller," she said, bending down to meet Eleanor's gaze. The old woman's fragile fingers reached out, gently resting on her arm in silent gratitude. But there was a shift in the air, a subtle unease. As Melanie helped Eleanor settle into her chair, she noticed the way Gregory's hand gripped the back of her mother's wheelchair, too tightly, almost possessively, as he pushed her toward the living room. His eyes, cold and calculating, met hers only briefly before he turned away. The luxurious house, once gleaming with opulence, suddenly felt heavy, suffocating. It was as if the walls themselves were holding a secret, a truth that no amount of wealth could hide. Melanie couldn't quite put her finger on it, but she felt it in her gut. This place was not just a mansion, it was a prison. As they entered the living room, the contrast between the warmth of Eleanor and the coldness of her son became even more apparent. Eleanor's eyes were soft, almost sad, but they still held a spark, a silent plea for something more than this controlled, emotionless existence. Gregory, on the other hand, was rigid, focused on his phone, his impatience palpable. Melanie felt the tension in the air, but before she could fully grasp the dynamics between mother and son, she heard it, a muffled sob. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct enough to make her pause. It came from somewhere behind a picture frame, nestled on the corner of the desk in the farthest corner of the room. Her heart skipped a beat. She glanced at Gregory, but he didn't seem to notice. The sob came again, louder this time. It was faint, but it sent a shiver down Melanie's spine. Was it the sound of someone crying? Someone in pain? She instinctively walked closer to the desk, her gaze fixed on the picture frame. Inside there was something odd. A camera, small, unassuming, hidden behind the glass. The lens pointed directly at Eleanor. It was then that Melanie realized this wasn't just a home. This was a house of secrets, a house of pain. Her pulse quickened. The sobs she had heard weren't just echoes. They were a cry for help. And someone was watching. As the camera's lens gleamed in the light, Melanie's heart raced. The truth was staring her in the face, but what was she willing to uncover? Melanie stepped into the Miller mansion, her shoes clicking softly against the polished marble floors, her heart racing in time with her footsteps. This place, with its sprawling rooms, towering ceilings, and opulent decorations, felt more like a museum than a home. Every inch of the house screamed wealth. Ornate chandeliers, paintings that likely cost more than she'd ever make in a year, and furniture that looked like it had never been sat on. The whole house gleamed, but there was an unsettling emptiness to it. Melanie's pulse quickened as she walked further into the grand foyer, her fingers still clenched around her purse. Gregory Miller had already led her through the first set of rooms, barely acknowledging her presence as they moved deeper into the mansion. The house was eerily quiet, the only sounds being the soft shuffle of Melanie's scrubs against the floor and the faint hum of air conditioning in the distance. She tried to focus on her job, tried to push aside the unease that settled in her stomach, but it was hard to ignore the constant feeling of being watched. Her first impression of Gregory Miller was one of controlled power. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and impeccably dressed. His expensive suit seemed to mold him like a second skin, every detail precisely in place. But there was something about his demeanor, something cold. The way he moved with purpose, as though he was the master of this house, of everyone in it. He didn't spare a glance in her direction as he walked ahead, his pace quick and brisk. Melanie struggled to keep up, her mind spinning with the overwhelming opulence of the home. Gregory stopped in front of a large door that led to the sitting room. He turned to her briefly, his gaze assessing her as though she were one more thing to be managed in his world of perfect order. "Eleanor's here. You'll be taking care of her," he said in a flat tone. There was no warmth in his words, only the cold expectation of someone who viewed people more as tools than as individuals. Melanie nodded, her mouth dry. She didn't know what to say, so she simply followed him into the room. The air inside was thick with the scent of fresh flowers and beeswax. The large windows let in a stream of sunlight that bathed the room in a golden glow, but it did little to warm the cold atmosphere. The furniture was impeccably arranged, almost too perfect, like a showpiece in a designer showroom. And then, there she was. Eleanor Miller sat in a wheelchair by the window, looking out at the perfectly manicured lawn. Her white hair was pulled back into an elegant bun, and she wore a soft blue cardigan that complemented the color of her eyes. Despite her frailty, there was a dignified air about her, a silent elegance that made her seem timeless. Her hands, though marked by age, were delicately resting on her lap, and she turned her head to greet Melanie with a soft, welcoming smile. "You must be Melanie," Eleanor said, her voice gentle like a breeze. A very warm welcome to our home. There was a sincerity in her eyes that instantly put Melanie at ease, a kindness that seemed to radiate from her like a beacon. Melanie felt a knot in her chest loosen as she smiled back. "It's nice to meet you, Mrs. Miller. I'm here to take care of you." Eleanor's smile deepened, but Melanie noticed the brief flicker of something in her eyes, something that looked like fear, quickly masked by a delicate veil of politeness. Gregory, who had been standing off to the side, watching the exchange, cleared his throat. The sound was sharp, almost like a reminder of his presence. "I'll leave you two to get acquainted," he said curtly, his tone lacking the warmth of his mother's. He turned sharply on his heel and left the room without another word, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. The moment Gregory left, the air in the room shifted. It wasn't just the silence, but the subtle change in the atmosphere, like the mansion itself had exhaled. Melanie noticed how Eleanor's posture seemed to relax slightly, the stiffness in her shoulders melting as she let out a quiet sigh. It was as though Gregory's presence had weighed her down, and the moment he was gone, she could breathe again. Eleanor looked at Melanie, her smile now a little more tired, her gaze soft but weary. "Gregory's very particular," she said, her voice trailing off, the words hanging in the air like a confession. Melanie smiled sympathetically, unsure of what to say. There was something about the way Eleanor spoke, the way her words seemed to hesitate, that made Melanie feel like there was more to this situation than she understood. "I'm sure we'll get along fine," Melanie said, her voice light, trying to ease the tension in the room. She felt an instant connection with Eleanor, something genuine, something human, buried beneath the cold walls of the mansion. As she moved to help Eleanor with her medication schedule, she noticed the small tremor in the older woman's hands. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make Melanie pause. Eleanor's hands were covered with light bruises, old marks that seemed to tell a story the woman wasn't ready to share. Melanie felt her heart tighten, but she said nothing, deciding to let it go for now. She wasn't here to pry into the past. She was here to help Eleanor with the future. Eleanor caught her eye as Melanie gently took the pillbox from the table and began to arrange the medications. Her eyes were filled with a silent sadness, and for the briefest of moments, their gazes locked. "I don't mean to be a burden, dear," Eleanor murmured softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "But there are some things that I can't control." Melanie's heart skipped a beat, but before she could respond, Eleanor quickly looked away, her gaze darting towards the window. The soft trembling in her hands seemed to intensify. The moment passed as quickly as it had come, but the weight of her words lingered in the room. Melanie knew something was wrong, but Eleanor wasn't ready to talk. Not yet. As Melanie began her shift, she could feel the tension in the room thickening, but it was Eleanor's last quiet words that unsettled her. There was fear hidden behind those eyes, and Melanie wasn't sure if it was from the son who seemed so distant or something else entirely. She had only just begun to scratch the surface of the Miller family's world, but already she knew this would be no ordinary job. The morning was crisp, and sunlight filtered through the tall windows of the Miller mansion, casting long shadows across the walls. Melanie moved quietly, trying to make her presence as unobtrusive as possible, though it was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore the heavy tension that seemed to hang in the air. The house, despite its pristine appearance, felt like a gilded cage, a place where appearances mattered more than comfort, and where the truth was often hidden behind layers of perfection. Today, as on every other day since she began her shift, Melanie's task was to care for Eleanor The old woman, now in her late 80s, required constant attention, from monitoring her medication to helping her with physical therapy exercises. It was routine, yet there was something about this house, this family, that unsettled Melanie. Each passing day only deepened her suspicion that there was more going on behind closed doors than she could see. Melanie had spent the morning carefully following the rigid schedule Gregory had outlined for her. Every moment in the Miller household was planned down to the last detail, from meals to rest periods. The air felt thick with the pressure of perfection, and Melanie could feel the weight of it every time she entered the room. But it wasn't until bath time that she first noticed the marks, the bruises on Eleanor's arms. It happened quietly. As she helped Eleanor undress for her bath, Melanie caught sight of something that made her pause. There, on Eleanor's upper arm, was a dark bruise, one that didn't look like the result of an innocent slip or a minor fall. It was the unmistakable shape of fingers, deep purple and yellowing at the edges. The bruise was fresh, too, a clear sign that it hadn't been there long. Melanie's breath caught in her throat. She forced herself to maintain a calm, professional demeanor, but the shock was undeniable. She had seen bruises like this before, on patients who had suffered from abusive caregivers. Melanie's years of nursing experience told her this wasn't an accident. This was something else, something darker. She continued to help Eleanor undress, her mind racing with questions. How had this happened? Who had done this to her? She gently lowered Eleanor into the warm water, trying to focus on the task at hand, but her thoughts kept circling back to the bruise on the woman's arm. It wasn't the only one. As she began to wash Eleanor's back, she noticed other bruises, on her shoulders, her back, and her legs, some older, others more recent. The bruises seemed to appear in patterns, like someone had gripped her too tightly. Melanie? Eleanor's voice was soft, pulling her out of her thoughts. The old woman turned her head slightly, her eyes meeting Melanie's. "Yes, Mrs. Miller?" Melanie asked, trying to mask the concern in her voice. "I've had a rough time getting around lately," Eleanor continued, her voice faltering slightly. "I'm getting older, and sometimes I trip." Her words seemed to hang in the air, but Melanie noticed how her eyes avoided meeting hers, how the old woman's hands clenched tightly around the edge of the bathtub, as if she were trying to hold herself together. Melanie gently bathed her hair, using a soft cloth, her fingers working methodically, but her mind was elsewhere. She knew Eleanor was lying. She could tell by the way she avoided her gaze, by the way her words didn't quite match the look in her eyes. The bruises weren't from clumsiness, and Melanie knew that for certain. They were the result of something more sinister, something hidden beneath the surface. "Mrs. Miller," Melanie began softly, her voice quiet but firm. "How did you get these bruises?" Eleanor froze, her body stiffening for just a moment before she slowly turned her head to look at Melanie. For a long, painful second, neither of them spoke. The tension between them grew, thickening the air. Melanie could see the fear in Eleanor's eyes now, and it chilled her to the bone. "I'm clumsy, dear," Eleanor finally whispered, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Age is unforgiving." The words felt like a lie, a rehearsed one. The way Eleanor's fingers trembled, how she tugged at the towel Melanie had wrapped around her, spoke volumes. Melanie's heart sank. She wasn't naive. She knew when someone was hiding the truth. And there was something about Eleanor's demeanor that screamed of fear. Fear not just of physical pain, but of something more elusive, something that was hiding in the shadows of this house. Melanie nodded, her heart heavy with the knowledge that the woman in front of her was not the innocent, frail lady she had initially appeared to be. There was something dark lurking in this house, and it was slowly coming to light. She finished the bath in silence, helping Eleanor back into her clothes, but her mind was already working overtime. How had this happened? And who was responsible? Was it Gregory? Or was there someone else in the house? Someone hidden from view? Someone who lurked in the corners, silently causing harm? Eleanor's eyes fluttered closed as she settled back into her chair, the weariness of age catching up with her. Melanie felt the weight of the woman's vulnerability in her chest. She couldn't ignore it any longer. Eleanor needed help, real help, and Melanie wasn't going to sit idly by while this woman, this kind, gentle soul, was being hurt. She had to do something, but she didn't know where to start. As she left Eleanor's room to check on the rest of her daily duties, Melanie's thoughts were consumed by the old woman's words, by the bruises, and by the silent plea for help that had been hidden in Eleanor's voice. It was clear now that something was terribly wrong, but the question remained: who could she trust? Melanie's steps faltered as she left the room. Her heart pounded in her chest as a chilling thought crossed her mind. What if Gregory didn't know? What if he was as much a victim of the household's twisted dynamics as Eleanor? But then another, darker thought took root. What if he did know? What if he was the one causing the bruises? She had to find out. But how could she expose the truth when she didn't even know where to begin? The days were beginning to blur together for Melanie as she continued her work at the Miller mansion. Each shift carried an undercurrent of tension that she could no longer ignore. The bruises on Eleanor's arms had haunted her thoughts since the bath, and every new interaction with the family, especially with Gregory, only deepened her growing unease. There was something profoundly wrong in this house, something Melanie couldn't quite pinpoint but felt deep in her bones. The house itself was an imposing structure, its grandiose design feeling more like a fortress than a home. But it wasn't just the physical isolation of the mansion that unsettled Melanie. It was the emotional coldness that permeated the air, a palpable disconnect between the people who lived here. Gregory's behavior towards his mother was a stark contrast to the warm, loving interactions Melanie had witnessed between her own family. He was distant, almost cruel in his detachment, treating Eleanor not as a mother, but as a burden. Melanie had been in the Miller home long enough now to witness Gregory's behavior up close. Each encounter was more unsettling than the last. The way he spoke to Eleanor, dismissing her with a cold indifference, sent a shiver down Melanie's spine. She could see it in the way Eleanor flinched at his voice, how she tensed when he entered the room, and how quickly she seemed to retreat into herself the moment he spoke. One afternoon, Melanie was in the living room with Eleanor, preparing her medication and setting up the physical therapy equipment when Gregory entered. His eyes immediately scanned the room, his gaze lingering on Melanie for a moment before turning to his mother. "Mother, I told you to rest, not waste your energy on these silly exercises," he snapped. His tone sharp, his words dismissive. Eleanor, as always, shrank back, her shoulders curling inward like she was trying to make herself invisible. Melanie clenched her jaw, her heart aching for the woman who had no defense against her son's harsh words. I'm fine, Gregory," Eleanor said, her voice quiet, almost apologetic. Just trying to keep moving. Keep moving. You're not some athlete, Mother. You're a frail old woman. Sit down, and let's get this over with." Gregory's voice was laced with a patronizing edge, his words barely masking his contempt. Melanie stood by, observing the scene with increasing discomfort. She had seen this dynamic before, in other homes she had worked in, families where the elderly were treated as burdens, where their needs were ignored or dismissed as unimportant. But the coldness between Gregory and Eleanor felt deeper, darker, more toxic than anything she had ever witnessed. As the scene unfolded, Melanie's internal conflict began to swell. She could feel the weight of the decision that was starting to loom over her. She had to protect Eleanor, but how? Should she report her suspicions to the authorities? If she did, would she be putting herself, and possibly Eleanor, at even greater risk? The idea of confronting Gregory, of accusing him of something so sinister, felt like a monumental risk. She wasn't sure if she could go through with it. Melanie's own experiences with abuse had taught her how dangerous it could be to speak out. She knew the risks that came with calling attention to something that wasn't yet proven. And what if she was wrong? What if she misunderstood the situation? The fear of making a mistake, of damaging Eleanor's life even more, made the decision all the more difficult. She couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out, that Eleanor's safety was hanging by a thread. But the more she observed Gregory, the more certain she became that something needed to be done. She could see it in his eyes. There was a cruelty to him that went beyond mere neglect. It was something deeper, something dangerous. One evening, Melanie found herself alone in the study, flipping through some of the medical records Gregory had left on the desk. She wasn't snooping, at least that's what she told herself. But there was a gnawing urge to uncover the truth, to find something that could explain the disparity between the family's outward appearance and what she knew to be happening behind closed doors. Her eyes scanned through the pages, and for a moment, she wondered if the answers might be there. But as she flipped through the papers, her attention was drawn to a section of the record that made her stomach churn, a brief mention of Eleanor's history of emotional instability and mood swings. It was written with such clinical detachment that it almost made her sick. There was no mention of any physical issues, no acknowledgement of the bruises Melanie had seen. It was as if the medical records were deliberately sanitized, scrubbed clean of any evidence of abuse. That was when the realization hit her. This was all part of the facade. Gregory was controlling the narrative, erasing any trace of his mother's suffering. He was carefully crafting a story that would make it impossible for anyone to question his actions. Melanie's mind raced. She had to find proof. Proof that would make it undeniable. Something that could protect Eleanor and expose the truth. But how could she do that without tipping off Gregory? She couldn't risk him becoming suspicious or retaliating. That night, as she sat in her modest apartment, Melanie made a decision. She would take matters into her own hands. She would gather evidence, something concrete, something that would show the world what was really happening in the Miller mansion. She knew it was dangerous. She knew it could backfire. But the thought of doing nothing was even more unbearable. She couldn't live with herself if she allowed Eleanor to suffer in silence while she stood by. Melanie's fingers trembled as she typed into the search bar of her laptop, hidden cameras for home use. She found what she was looking for almost immediately, discrete cameras that could be hidden in everyday objects. It was the perfect solution, allowing her to capture footage without being detected. Her heart pounded in her chest as she clicked purchase. The camera would arrive in 2 days. She couldn't help but feel a rush of both fear and excitement. She was taking the first step toward uncovering the truth. She was about to do something that would change everything. The next day, as Melanie went about her daily routine at the mansion, she was more determined than ever. Every interaction with Gregory, every moment spent with Eleanor, felt weighted with the knowledge that she was now playing a dangerous game. But she couldn't stop. She couldn't turn back. She had made her choice, and there was no going back now. As the tension rises in the Miller household, Melanie's moral conflict intensifies. Will she expose the truth or will fear hold her back? Stay tuned as we uncover the dark secrets behind closed doors. Don't forget to comment your thoughts below. What would you do in Melanie's shoes? The camera arrived at her apartment a few days later. Melanie held the small, discreet device in her hands, feeling a rush of both anticipation and dread. She wasn't sure what she would find, but she knew she couldn't stop now. The game had changed. She was no longer just a caregiver. She was now a detective, trying to uncover the dark truth behind the Miller family's perfect facade. Melanie felt a sense of unease as she entered Eleanor's room the next morning. The air seemed heavier, charged with a foreboding that mirrored the anxious thrum in her chest. She had never felt so conflicted. so pulled between her sense of duty and the terrifying risks of what she was about to do. Today she wasn't just going to observe, she was going to act. The camera she had ordered had arrived 2 days ago, and she had spent every spare moment setting it up, familiarizing herself with its tiny form and discreet lens. It was small enough to go unnoticed, concealed in the corner of a bookshelf where Eleanor usually kept her knickknacks. It had a motion sensor that would activate the recording once there was movement, ensuring that nothing was missed. Melanie double-checked the camera's placement, making sure it was hidden well enough to avoid detection. She was taking a massive risk. If Gregory or Veronica discovered it, she could lose everything. Her job, her safety, maybe even her freedom. But the thought of Eleanor suffering without anyone knowing what was happening, the idea of doing nothing was unbearable. Melanie knew she was the only one who could help. The first few days after installing the camera were torturous. Every morning, she would enter Eleanor's room, trying to act normal while feeling the weight of the secret she was keeping. But each time, her eyes would flit to the bookshelf, her stomach churning as she wondered what the camera was capturing in the dark corners of the room. She couldn't bear the thought of not knowing, of letting Eleanor's suffering continue without being able to stop it. Then, the day came when she finally found the courage to watch the footage. Sitting at her desk, her fingers trembling as she clicked play, Melanie felt a sickening knot form in her stomach. The footage was grainy, but the movements were clear enough. Eleanor was sitting in her bed, her frail body huddled beneath the covers. It was a familiar scene. The camera had captured this exact moment many times before. Melanie had seen Eleanor like this 100 times. But then, the door opened. Veronica entered the frame. At first, Melanie thought it was just another typical interaction, a daughter checking in on her mother. But there was something about the way Veronica moved, her tight, controlled posture that made Melanie freeze. The hair on the back of her neck stood up as she watched Veronica approach Eleanor's bed with a chilling calmness. The camera's perspective was slightly distorted, but what happened next was unmistakable. Veronica grabbed Eleanor's arm roughly, yanking her out of the bed. The sound of fabric tearing was barely audible over the low hum of the footage, but the pain in Eleanor's eyes was clear. She winced, her frail body trembling as Veronica gripped her arm with terrifying force. "Get up, Mother." Veronica's voice was sharp, cold. "You think I'll let you lie here all day like this? You've become a burden." Melanie's heart skipped a beat as she watched in horror. Eleanor's pale face flushed with humiliation, but she didn't fight back. She couldn't. Veronica twisted her arm again, harder this time, making Eleanor let out a muffled cry of pain. Melanie had to turn away from the screen for a moment. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't bear to watch this anymore. But she knew she had to. She couldn't stop now. Eleanor's attempts to free herself were weak, her frailty evident as Veronica pulled her up from the bed. Melanie could see the fear in Eleanor's eyes as she stumbled, her body unable to resist the abuse. Veronica slapped her across the face, not once but twice, each strike punctuating the venomous words she hurled at her mother. "You're nothing but a burden, Eleanor. You've never been anything more than a drain on this family. I should have sent you away years ago." The impact of the slap reverberated through the footage, and Eleanor crumpled onto the floor, gasping for breath. Veronica stood over her, her chest rising and falling with anger, the power imbalance between them more visible than ever. Melanie felt sick, her stomach twisting as the tears began to sting her eyes. The camera kept rolling as Veronica stood over her mother, seething with rage. Melanie's pulse quickened as she watched Veronica lean down and grab Eleanor by the hair, yanking her back to her feet with an unrelenting grip. The tears on Eleanor's face were impossible to ignore. The footage was clear now. There was no denying the abuse. Melanie hit pause, her hand shaking as she pressed it to her mouth. The images were burned into her mind, and the sense of urgency hit her like a hammer. She had the proof now, The undeniable, horrific proof that Eleanor's suffering was real. Veronica was a monster, a predator, and no one had been brave enough to speak out against her. Until now. But the weight of the footage felt heavy in her hands, more responsibility than she was prepared for. She wasn't just holding evidence anymore, she was holding a woman's life in her hands. She was the only one who could stop this, the only one who could expose the truth. Melanie's phone buzzed in her hand, breaking her from the trance she had fallen into. She glanced at the screen. It was a text from Sarah, the nurse who had always been a quiet ally. Be careful. Veronica's back early today. Melanie's heart skipped. She hadn't even realized the time. Hadn't thought of the consequences of being caught. Her hands began to tremble again as her mind raced. She had to act. She had to go to the authorities, show them the video. She could no longer sit idly by, watching Eleanor suffer in silence. But before she could move, the door to her apartment creaked open. Her pulse surged. She hadn't heard anyone coming, and it was too late to turn back. Veronica's voice cut through the air. "What the hell do you think you're doing, Melanie?" Melanie froze. Veronica stood in the doorway, her eyes wide with fury. In that instant, everything stopped. The world tilted. Veronica's presence alone made the air feel thick with danger, her every step a threat. "You didn't think you could hide this, did you?" Veronica's voice was low, dangerous, a venomous whisper that made Melanie's skin crawl. The video, the camera, Veronica knew. Melanie's mind raced, every option flashing through her head as she scrambled for a way out. The room felt suffocating, and her heartbeat rang in her ears. She had been caught. The confrontation had come too soon, and she had no choice but to face the woman who had terrorized Eleanor for so long. The time for careful planning had passed. The truth was about to come crashing down. Melanie's mind was a whirlwind, but her only focus now was escaping Veronica's wrath, and somehow getting the proof to the right people before it was too late. The seconds dragged on, thick with tension, as Melanie stood frozen in her living room, her hand still gripping her phone. Veronica's icy glare sent a chill down her spine, and her heart hammered in her chest. She knew the game was up. Veronica had found the camera, and with it, everything Melanie had been working toward came crashing down. The truth was no longer just a secret. It was an imminent threat. "What the hell do you think you're doing, Melanie?" Veronica's voice dripped with venom, her tone laced with malicious amusement. "Did you think you could get away with this? Hiding cameras in my home? In my mother's room?" Melanie felt a sickening wave of panic surge within her. Veronica knew, and with that knowledge came an overwhelming realization. She was no longer in control. Veronica's next words only confirmed the fear gnawing at Melanie's insides. "Let me guess. You've been gathering evidence to turn me in?" Veronica continued, her eyes narrowing with cold fury. "You think you can ruin my life, expose me for something that wasn't even my fault? You'll pay for this, Melanie." Melanie tried to steady her breath, her mind whirling with 1,000 thoughts. The camera was gone now, destroyed, and she had no way of proving what had been happening in the mansion. Veronica's power was undeniable, and every part of Melanie's body screamed to flee. But she couldn't, not without Eleanor, not without making sure that the truth was exposed, no matter what Veronica threw at her. "You won't get away with this," Melanie managed to say, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and determination. "I'll make sure the police see this. They'll find the footage, and you won't be able to hide from what you've done." Veronica smirked, her lips curling with a cruel, triumphant twist. "Police? You think anyone's going to believe you over me? You're just a nurse. You don't even belong here." Her words were deliberate, sharp, designed to strip away Melanie's confidence. The room felt smaller, suffocating. Melanie's hands were cold, clammy, and her thoughts raced. What could she do now? Veronica was a master manipulator, and if there was one thing Melanie had learned in her time at the mansion, It was that Veronica always had control. But she wasn't about to back down without a fight. She had already sacrificed so much for Eleanor. She wasn't going to let it all be destroyed by a single woman's cruelty. "Veronica, I won't let you get away with this," Melanie said again, her voice growing steadier. "I've already sent the footage to a friend. You can't delete it fast enough to stop it from getting out." Veronica's eyes flashed with rage. "You think I don't know how to deal with threats like you? You really believe you have the upper hand?" She stepped closer, her face now inches from Melanie's, her breath hot with anger. "You're nothing, Melanie. You're just a disposable little nurse in a mansion full of people who don't care about you. And you think you can fight me?" The venom in her words stung. It felt like a punch in the gut, knocking the air from Melanie's lungs. But even as Veronica's threats rattled her, something deep inside Melanie refused to crumble. She was not disposable. She had proven that by risking everything for Eleanor, by fighting for the woman who had no one else. "I'm not afraid of you," Melanie said, though the quiver in her voice betrayed her fear. "You can't keep getting away with this. I won't be your pawn anymore." Veronica's eyes flared with a cold, calculating fury. Without a word, she reached out, her fingers quick as she snatched the phone from Melanie's hands. The screen flashed as she tapped and swiped, and Melanie's heart sank. "No," Melanie whispered, horrified. "What are you doing?" Veronica's lips curled into a twisted smile as she deleted the footage. Every moment of abuse, every horrifying second, was wiped away with a single motion. Melanie's hands clenched into fists, but she couldn't move. She could only watch in helpless disbelief as Veronica held the phone up, showing her the screen. "I can't have you causing any more trouble," Veronica said, her voice low, menacing. "I'm not going to let you ruin my life. I'll have you removed from this house. No one will believe you. You're nothing but a liar, a nobody." Melanie's mind reeled. The footage, gone. The evidence of Eleanor's abuse, erased. In that moment, everything she had fought for seemed to shatter. What had she been doing? She had risked her job, her safety, and her dignity for this woman, for Eleanor, and now it felt like it was all slipping away. Veronica's voice cut through her thoughts like a knife. "Pack your bags. You're leaving today. I'll make sure you're out of here before you can do any more damage. You don't belong here. Not anymore." Melanie's stomach twisted as she felt the full weight of Veronica's threat. Losing her job was one thing, but Veronica wasn't just trying to expel her from the mansion. She was threatening to destroy her life, to take everything away. "Don't do this," Melanie said, the words a quiet plea as she looked into Veronica's eyes. "I won't go quietly. You won't silence me." Veronica raised an eyebrow. "Try me, you're already defeated. It's over. You'll be gone by the time anyone even notices you're missing." The words stung, each one a reminder of just how powerless Melanie had become in this moment. She had no allies in this house, no one who would stand by her now. Veronica had won. As Veronica turned on her heel, Melanie stood frozen in place, the weight of everything that had transpired pressing down on her chest. Her mind raced. What would she do now? How could she protect Eleanor? How could she get the truth out? Everything she had worked for, everything she had fought for, was crumbling around her. As Melanie stands paralyzed by the weight of Veronica's threat, the tension peaks, giving the audience a brief moment to catch their breath. A perfect time for a break, keeping viewers on edge and ensuring they don't look away. With the footage deleted, Veronica's threat looming, and the walls closing in, Melanie has one choice left: risk everything and confront Veronica once more, or pack her bags and leave the mansion, forever. The night had fallen over the mansion like a heavy blanket, muffling the sounds of the world outside. Melanie sat in her apartment, staring at her phone. Her thoughts were consumed by the events of the day. The confrontation with Veronica, the destruction of the camera footage, and the cold, suffocating sense of defeat that had settled in her chest. Her mind was a whirlwind of what-ifs and regrets, and for the first time, she wondered if everything she had done was in vain. Her hands were shaking as she scrolled through the contacts in her phone, her thumb hovering over the name Eleanor Miller. What could she do now? Was it over? Had Veronica's threats finally silenced her? The thought of walking away from the woman she had come to care for, the woman she had promised to protect, was unbearable. Suddenly, the shrill sound of her phone ringing cut through the silence, snapping Melanie out of her daze. Her heart skipped a beat. The screen displayed an unknown number, the same one that had called her before. Melanie's breath caught in her throat. Could it be Eleanor? Was this the call she had been waiting for? Without hesitation, Melanie swiped to answer, her heart racing. She brought the phone to her ear, her hands trembling. "Melanie, it's Eleanor." The voice on the other end was barely a whisper, ragged with fear and panic. "Please, you have to help me. I don't know how much longer I can take this." Melanie's pulse quickened, a wave of relief and dread washing over her. Eleanor was alive. She was talking to her, but the fear in Eleanor's voice, anxiety, desperation, sent chills down Melanie's spine. "What's happening, Eleanor? What's going on? Where are you?" Melanie asked, her voice shaky but filled with urgency. Eleanor's voice cracked. "I'm being moved to a facility. Melanie, I don't want to go. Veronica, she found the number you left for me. She found it, and now I think she's going to send me away to some place where no one will find me." Her words broke off into a sob, and Melanie could hear the faint sounds of shuffling, muffled voices in the background. "Eleanor, listen to me. I'm coming for you," Melanie said quickly, her mind already racing with plans. "Where are you? Tell me exactly where you are right now. I'll get you out, I swear I will." "I don't know. I think they're coming for me." "Veronica," she said, "I won't see you again. I can't. Melanie, I'm scared." Eleanor's voice wavered, filled with a terror that pierced through Melanie's heart. Melanie's breath caught in her throat as the words sank in. They're coming for her. Veronica wasn't just threatening her anymore. She was acting. Eleanor was being moved to a facility, a place where no one would find her, a place where Melanie would never be able to protect her again. "Eleanor, stay on the line. Please stay on the line. I'm coming to you now. I'm on my way. Don't hang up." Melanie's voice was frantic now, the gravity of the situation sinking in with every word. But before Eleanor could respond, there was a sudden sound, a sharp intake of breath, followed by the distinct noise of a door slamming shut. Then, a strangled cry broke through the line, and Melanie's stomach dropped. "Eleanor? Eleanor, talk to me, please," she shouted. But all she could hear was the frantic sound of footsteps, the rustling of movement. Then a muffled thud. A scream. The phone line went dead. Melanie stood frozen in the middle of her apartment, the phone still pressed to her ear, but the connection was lost. The line was silent. No more breaths, no more sobs, just the deafening quiet of the line cutting out. A sickening fear gripped her. She felt it in the pit of her stomach crawling up her spine. Something was happening. Something terrible. She could feel it. And it was happening now. Her heart pounded in her chest as she fumbled for her car keys. She couldn't waste another second. Eleanor needed her. Veronica was moving fast, and if Melanie didn't act now, she feared she might lose her forever. The car engine roared to life as Melanie tore out of her parking space, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The streets of the city blurred in front of her, but all she could focus on was Eleanor's voice, the fear, the desperation. Eleanor had called her for help, and now Melanie was her only chance. With each red light that slowed her progress, Melanie's anxiety grew. Time was slipping away. The mansion was nearly an hour from her apartment, and she didn't know if she could make it in time. What if I'm too late? The thought gnawed at her insides, but she pushed it away. She couldn't think like that. She had to stay focused. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, startling her, but she didn't have the luxury of checking it. Not now. She couldn't afford distractions. Eleanor's life was on the line. As she sped down the dark, empty streets, every second felt like an eternity. Her mind raced with worst-case scenarios. What if Veronica had already moved her? What if they were already on their way to the facility? What if her phone buzzed again, this time with a message? She hesitated for just a moment before pulling it from her pocket. Her heart skipped a beat when she saw the message from Sarah, the woman who had helped her earlier, the woman who had been the first to notice the abuse. Melanie, I think I saw something. You need to hurry. Something's wrong. I have a bad feeling about this. The words sent a chill down her spine, but there was no time to dwell on them. She shoved the phone back in her pocket, slamming her foot down on the accelerator. The mansion was coming into view, the massive, foreboding structure looming in the distance like a dark shadow. She was almost there. Almost. The house appeared to be shrouded in darkness. No lights, no movement, but she knew better than to assume everything was quiet. Veronica's cruel influence stretched far, and whatever she was doing to keep Eleanor quiet, to keep her from escaping, had likely already started. Melanie pulled into the driveway with a screech, her tires squealing against the asphalt. She was out of the car in an instant, running toward the front door. Her heart raced as she approached the mansion, her eyes scanning for any sign of Eleanor. The door was locked. Of course it was. Veronica knew she'd come, and she wasn't going to make it easy. Melanie slammed her fist against the door, but no one answered. She didn't have time to waste. She turned to the side of the house, looking for another way in. She was desperate. She could feel it in her bones. The clock was ticking. If she didn't act now, Eleanor might be gone forever. Just as Melanie spots a window slightly ajar, a voice echoes through the darkness, Gregory's voice calling out to her. His tone is cold, almost disinterested, but Melanie doesn't stop. He's not going to stop me now. She has to get inside, has to save Eleanor before it's too late. But as she makes her way toward the window, the sound of a door opening behind her freezes her in place. The sound of approaching footsteps, the unmistakable click of high heels on stone, echoes in the stillness. Veronica is coming, and this time she's not going to let Melanie stop her. The cold wind bit at Melanie's skin as she stood in the driveway of the Miller mansion, heart hammering in her chest. She had come so close, only to be stopped at every turn by Veronica's cunning. She was running out of time. Every moment that passed, she feared Eleanor would slip further from her grasp, trapped in a facility designed to erase her memory, her will, her identity. But there was still one thing she could do. The video, the one thing Veronica hadn't counted on, the one thing that could expose the truth for good. Inside her car, Melanie fumbled with her phone, desperate for some form of confirmation. Her fingers trembled as she unlocked the device and navigated to her email inbox. She found it in a folder labeled Saved. The email she had sent herself months ago, before Veronica had confronted her, before the threat started, before everything spiraled out of control. The video was still there, intact, just as she had sent it. Melanie opened the file and watched it once again, her stomach churning with each frame. The footage was damning. Veronica assaulting Eleanor in the dead of night, pulling her arms, slapping her, whispering cruel threats as the old woman pleaded in agony. The audio, though faint, was unmistakable. Every frame burned into Melanie's memory as the horrors of what Eleanor had endured played before her eyes. Melanie's chest tightened as she wiped away a tear, but she didn't let herself falter. There was no more time for hesitation. This evidence was everything. This was her chance to bring justice to Eleanor. She dialed Dr. Martin's number. The phone rang twice before he picked up. "Melanie? What's happened? I've been trying to reach you." "I have it," she said, voice barely a whisper. "The video. I have the proof. Veronica, she's been abusing Eleanor all along, and I have everything we need to put her away." There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end of the line. Then Dr. Martin's voice filled with urgency. "Where are you?" "We need to get this to the authorities now. I'm on my way. I'll meet you at the hospital." "Let's do this," Melanie replied, determination filling her voice. She was done being afraid, done playing by Veronica's rules. This was her moment to fight back. At the hospital, Melanie met Dr. Martin in the emergency entrance. He was flanked by 2 uniformed police officers, their serious faces setting the tone for the gravity of the situation. "Melanie," Dr. Martin greeted her, his face grave. "This is Officer Adams and Officer Sanchez. We'll handle the rest from here. I'll take care of Eleanor's medical needs. You just focus on getting Veronica arrested." Melanie nodded, her breath coming in sharp bursts as she handed over her phone to Officer Adams, who examined the video with a practiced eye. "This is all we need," Officer Adams said, his voice firm as he passed the phone to his partner. "We'll send this straight to the prosecutor's office. We'll start a warrant for Veronica's arrest immediately." Melanie could feel the weight of what was about to happen. The truth was finally coming to light, and it was a truth Veronica would never be able to escape. An hour later, Melanie sat in the police car, her heart pounding as they drove toward the Miller mansion. She could see the flashing lights ahead, police cars converging in front of the estate like an ominous sea of red and blue. The tension in her chest felt unbearable. This was it. The moment she had been waiting for. The moment that would change everything. As the patrol car screeched to a halt, Melanie could see Veronica standing near the front door, her arms crossed. An expression of disbelief etched across her face as she saw the officers approach. She tried to stand her ground, her posture rigid, but there was a look in her eyes that betrayed the mask of confidence she'd worn all these months. "You're under arrest for the abuse of Eleanor Miller," Officer Sanchez declared, her voice unwavering. Veronica's eyes widened in shock, but the mask quickly slid back into place. "This is absurd," she spat, her voice dripping with venom. "You have no right to do this. I'm married to Gregory Miller. You can't just barge into my home like this. Gregory Miller is not going to save you this time," Officer Adams responded. "You've been caught. Your husband's about to find out the truth, too." Veronica's face twisted with rage, but there was nowhere for her to run. She was cuffed and shoved into the back of a patrol car, her protests fading into the distance. Melanie walked toward the mansion, her pulse quickening with every step. This was not just about exposing Veronica. This was about giving Eleanor the life she deserved, free from fear. This was about redemption for a woman who had suffered in silence for far too long. Inside, she found Gregory pacing the living room, his face a mixture of anger and confusion. His posture stiffened when he saw Melanie enter. "What's going on? Why are the police here?" he demanded, his eyes narrowing. "Your wife has been arrested for elder abuse," Melanie said, her voice low but clear. "And you've been enabling her. You've known about what she's been doing to your mother. And you've done nothing." Gregory's face blanched, and for the first time since Melanie had met him, his confident, self-assured exterior began to crumble. He took a faltering step back, his eyes wide with disbelief. No, I didn't know," he stammered, his voice breaking. I didn't know." "You did," Melanie said sharply. "You turned a blind eye to it. You ignored the signs, you let her do whatever she wanted, and you didn't protect your own mother. You failed her." Gregory's shoulders slumped, the weight of the truth crashing down on him like a tidal wave. His eyes welled with tears as the reality of his failures settled in. "Oh God," he whispered, his voice cracking. "What have I done?" Melanie stood silently, watching him unravel. It was a painful sight, but she couldn't feel sorry for him. He had to face the consequences of his actions. Later that night, the Miller mansion felt eerily quiet. The police had taken Veronica away, and Gregory was left alone with his thoughts, the guilt of his negligence pressing on him like a physical weight. Melanie stood in the doorway of Eleanor's room, watching the woman who had once been broken and afraid now resting peacefully in her bed. For the first time in months, Eleanor's face was relaxed, the lines of fear and worry replaced with a soft, almost serene expression. She was safe, finally. Gregory entered the room slowly, his face a mess of emotions. He looked at his mother, then at Melanie, his eyes filled with regret. "I don't know how to fix this," he said hoarsely, his voice low. "I don't know how to make up for what I've done." Melanie's gaze softened. "You can start by being here for her now. That's all she needs. She just needs you to be here, to show her you care. You failed her once, but you can still make it right." Gregory nodded slowly, his eyes welling with tears again as he sat beside his mother. "I'll never be able to make it right," he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. But Melanie didn't disagree. She couldn't. She just stood in the doorway, watching as the broken pieces of a family began to rebuild themselves. Slowly, painfully, but with hope that this time, they would get it right. As Gregory sat beside his mother, cradling her hand in his, he glanced up at Melanie, his face etched with exhaustion. "I don't know how I could have been so blind," he murmured, his voice broken. "I thought I was protecting her, but I was the one keeping her in chains. Can you forgive me?" Melanie met his gaze, her eyes unwavering. "I don't know. You'll have to prove it," she said softly. But in her heart, she knew the road ahead would be long, and Gregory had a lot of work to do to earn back the trust he had lost. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the Miller mansion, casting a soft glow on Eleanor's face as she sat in her favorite chair in the garden. The roses that Melanie had carefully tended to bloomed brightly, symbolizing the renewal not only of the garden, but of Eleanor's life. For the first time in months, Eleanor looked at peace. The bruises, both visible and hidden, were beginning to fade, but it was the healing in her heart that had truly begun. Eleanor's recovery, both physically and emotionally, was slow, but it was steady. Dr. Martin continued to monitor her progress, ensuring her body healed from the years of abuse. But more importantly, he worked with her to help process the trauma she had endured. The nightmares that once plagued her at night became less frequent, and the fear that had once frozen her in place was now being replaced with a quiet but strong resolve. Gregory had been by her side every day. The man who had once turned a blind eye to his mother's suffering was now her fiercest protector. He spent hours with her, talking through the pain and regret that had consumed him for so long. The transformation in Gregory was profound. The arrogance that had once defined him as a successful businessman was now replaced with humility and a deep, genuine desire to make things right. Melanie watched from the sidelines, silently proud of the progress the Miller family was making. She had always known that Eleanor was strong, stronger than anyone gave her credit for. But she also knew that it would take time for the bonds of trust between mother and son to fully heal. Days passed, and the mansion, once a place of tension and fear, now felt like a home again. Gregory began to spend more time with his mother, taking her to therapy sessions and sitting with her during meals, making up for all the lost years. Eleanor began to laugh again, her voice once quiet and timid, now filled with joy as she shared stories from her past with Gregory, recalling memories they had both nearly forgotten. Melanie had become a permanent fixture in their lives, not just as a caregiver, but as a cornerstone of the healing process. She had fought for Eleanor when no one else would, and her dedication had proven more valuable than anything Gregory's wealth could offer. As the days turned into weeks, Melanie felt more like a member of the Miller family than just their nurse. One afternoon, as Melanie was sitting with Eleanor in the garden, She received a surprising phone call from Dr. Martin. His voice was upbeat, but Melanie could sense the weight of something important in his tone. "Melanie, I have something for you," Dr. Martin said. "It's not every day I get to call someone with such great news. You've been nominated for a scholarship, one that could change your life." Melanie's heart skipped a beat. "A scholarship? For what?" "For medical school," Dr. Martin replied. "I submitted your name, Melanie. Your story, your courage, and your commitment to Eleanor, not to mention your relentless pursuit of justice. Well, the scholarship committee felt it was a perfect fit." Melanie sat back, stunned. She had dreamed of becoming a doctor for as long as she could remember, but it had always seemed out of reach. An impossible dream buried beneath the demands of raising her daughter and working a job that barely paid the bills. Now it was becoming a reality. A door that had once been closed was suddenly wide open. I don't know what to say," Melanie whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You don't have to say anything," Dr. Martin said warmly. "Just take the opportunity. You've earned it." That evening, the entire Miller family gathered in the living room to celebrate Eleanor's progress and Melanie's incredible news. Gregory, who had once been distant and cold, now smiled openly at Melanie, gratitude shining in his eyes. "You've done more for this family than I could ever express." "Melanie," Gregory said, his voice thick with emotion, "you saved my mother's life, and you've given me the chance to be the son she deserves." Melanie nodded, but didn't speak. She wasn't sure what to say. She wasn't looking for praise or recognition. She had done it because it was the right thing to do. But hearing it from Gregory, hearing him acknowledge his failings and his desire to be better, was something Melanie could never have expected. She had hoped for healing, but she never imagined it would come in such an unexpected way. The conversation turned to Eleanor, who was seated nearby, quietly watching the scene unfold. She had regained some strength, though her body remained frail. Gregory took her hand gently, looking at her with a tenderness that had once been foreign to him. "I'm so sorry, Mom," Gregory said, his voice breaking. "I know I can never make up for the years I wasn't there for you. But I promise, I will always be here from now on. I will never turn my back on you again." Eleanor, who had endured so much pain, looked up at him with a faint smile. "I know, my son. I know." Her voice was soft but full of forgiveness. Melanie watched the exchange quietly, a sense of fulfillment settling in her chest. It wasn't just Eleanor's recovery that mattered. It was the restoration of their family, the rebuilding of trust, and the healing of the wounds that had been inflicted on all of them. The following day, as the family continued to rebuild, Eleanor made a quiet request to Melanie. She had asked Gregory to bring her a small, velvet box, and as she handed it to Melanie, her eyes were filled with emotion. "This," Eleanor said, "was my mother's. It's been passed down through the generations. A family heirloom, and now I want to pass it on to you." Inside the box was a delicate antique pearl necklace. The pearls shimmered in the light, their smooth surfaces reflecting the years of history they carried with them. Eleanor placed the necklace gently around Melanie's neck, her hands shaking slightly with the weight of the gesture. "You are a part of this family now," Eleanor said, her voice steady. "You've shown us what true courage and love are. You gave me my life back, and for that, I will always be grateful." Tears filled Melanie's eyes as she touched the pearls, feeling the weight of the necklace not just in the physical sense, but in the deep bond it symbolized. She had fought for Eleanor. She had saved her. And now, she was truly a part of the family. If you've been inspired by Melanie's journey, hit that subscribe button and leave a comment to show your support for justice and compassion. This story isn't just about one woman's fight. It's about the power of hope, healing, and the strength of a family coming together. Let's continue to spread love and support for those who need it most. The journey from brokenness to healing had been long and painful. But as Melanie looked at Eleanor, Gregory, and Charlotte, who were now a real family, she knew that every sacrifice had been worth it. This was a new beginning, not just for Eleanor, but for them all. They had rebuilt their lives, and they would never let go of the love they had found. As the sun set over the Miller mansion, Melanie stood with Sophie by her side, the pearl necklace still warm against her skin. For the first time in years, she felt whole. The family she had once only dreamed of was now hers, built not from blood, but from love, courage, and the belief that redemption was always possible. This was only the beginning. The once grand but cold Miller mansion now felt like a home. The laughter that echoed through the hallways was no longer forced, nor was the silence that had once settled over the house full of tension. It was the sound of healing, of years lost but now being reclaimed. The transformation was not just in the walls or in the decor, but in the people who lived within them. Eleanor, sitting in her favorite chair by the garden, looked at peace. The vibrant roses around her, now in full bloom, served as a reminder of the growth that had taken place not only in the garden, but in her heart. Melanie sat beside her, the gentle breeze swaying the roses, feeling a contentment she had never known. Eleanor was no longer the frail, broken woman she had once been. Her strength had returned, both physically and emotionally. The abuse, the fear, the tears, those were now a part of her past, and she was finally living a life of dignity. Gregory, who had once been a man of arrogance and coldness, now stood by his mother's side, his demeanor completely changed. Gone was the man who would turn a blind eye to suffering in favor of wealth and status. He had spent months reconciling with the past, learning to care for his mother in ways that went far beyond simple provision. He listened to her, shared her memories, and truly began to understand the depth of the damage caused by his neglect. And in doing so, he had regained a part of himself that he had lost. Melanie's life had changed beyond recognition. Just months ago, she had been a nurse, struggling to make ends meet, carrying the weight of a life that often felt like it was slipping out of her control. But now, as she looked at the Miller family before her, Eleanor, Gregory, and Sophie, she saw the incredible path her life had taken. It wasn't just about what she had done for Eleanor anymore. It was about the life she had built, the love she had found, and the family she had helped restore. The scholarship to medical school was a dream she had never thought possible. It was the opportunity to become a doctor, to make a real difference in people's lives. But even more than that, it was proof that she had become someone worthy of such an opportunity. She had proven to herself that she was capable of more than just surviving. She was now living with purpose, with a future full of promise. And her daughter, Sophie, would have the security she had always dreamed of. As Melanie sat with Sophie on her lap, watching Gregory and Eleanor talk quietly nearby, a sense of fulfillment washed over her. Her daughter was safe. Her dreams were within reach. And most importantly, she had found a family, one that accepted her not for what she could provide, but for who she was. A mother, a protector, a healer. Gregory approached Melanie, his eyes filled with gratitude and a deep, unspoken apology. "I'll never be able to truly make up for everything," he said softly, his voice sincere. "But I promise I will spend the rest of my life trying to be the son my mother deserves. And the man you, and this family, need me to be." Melanie smiled, her heart swelling with emotion. "I know," she said simply. "And I believe you." Sophie tugged at Melanie's sleeve, bringing her back to the present. "Mommy," she said, her voice full of innocent pride, "you're the bravest person in the world." Melanie's heart caught in her throat as she looked at her daughter, who was beaming with pure admiration. The weight of those words, spoken by a child who had seen only love and protection, was heavier than anything she had ever felt. Sophie didn't know the struggles, the fears, or the danger her mother had faced. To Sophie, Melanie had simply been her protector, the woman who had always been there when it counted. As Melanie looked at her daughter, she realized that Sophie had become the catalyst for everything. It was for her that Melanie had fought, had risked everything, and had pushed forward in the face of insurmountable odds. Now Sophie's life would be different. She would grow up in a house full of love, security, and support, a stark contrast to the way Melanie had grown up. As evening fell over the Miller mansion, Eleanor called everyone together. The last few months had been a whirlwind, but now, in this moment of peace, Eleanor felt it was time to mark the progress they had made. "I want to make a promise," she began, her voice strong despite the weight of everything she had been through. "We're all here because we chose to be, because we fought for each other. Melanie," she said, turning to her with a look of pride in her eyes, "you are not just part of our family. You are our family." Tears welled in Melanie's eyes, but she didn't speak. She simply nodded, her heart full. Eleanor continued, "And I promise, from this moment forward, we will never forget how far we've come. We will honor what we've rebuilt, what we've healed, and we will always have each other's backs, no matter what." What do you think of Melanie's journey? Leave a comment below and subscribe to see more stories like this. Her story is proof that no matter how broken things seem, there is always a chance for healing and redemption, and that the love we give to others can return to us in ways we never expect. Melanie stood at the window, gazing out at the tranquil garden that had once seemed so cold and imposing. Now, it felt like the heart of the home, a place of rebirth, of second chances. She had come so far, from struggling to pay bills, to fighting for a woman she barely knew, to finding a family she had always dreamed of. The necklace that Eleanor had given her gleamed softly around her neck, a symbol of her new life, of the role she had come to cherish in this family. She had found love, redemption, and the future she thought she had lost. With Gregory, Eleanor, and Sophie by her side, Melanie knew one thing for sure. This was where she was meant to be. This was home.